He never promised her love, only shelter. But in his silence, she found the gentlest kind of grace. And in his arms, a place her heart had been praying for. It was never meant to be a love story, just a vow, a roof, a shared silence beneath a storm-worn sky. But sometimes, the slowest love is the one that lasts longest. And if you've ever believed that real love doesn't always start with a kiss, but with a quiet presence that never leaves, then this story was meant for you. Subscribe, and if your heart is open tonight, drop a 1 in the comments. Because what you're about to hear isn't a fairy tale. It's the story of Sister Magdalena, a woman who gave her whole life to God, until one letter, one dusty road, and one broken cowboy with dusk in his eyes taught her that some love is sent by heaven, even if it wears spurs. Sister Magdalena had once believed her path was sealed in stone. At 23, she had taken the veil not out of fear, but out of heartbreak, so profound, she thought no man could ever reach her again. Her name had once been Maria Elena Vasquez, the daughter of a devout Mexican family in Santa Fe. Gentle, bright, in love. She was set to be married in spring beneath the old mission cross to the only man who had ever made her laugh like sunlight. But the letter came instead. One sentence, cold and careful, from the man she trusted most. "Forgive me, but I cannot." Shame, silence, and a mother who could no longer look her in the eye. So she ran not away from God, but toward him, hoping he might hold the pieces no man ever would. For 10 years, she belonged to no one but her faith. She taught children, tended the sick, slept with a rosary beneath her pillow. Her vows became her shield, her silence her comfort. She had made peace with solitude. She had made peace with dying alone until the day she was sent to Red Fern Ridge, a dusty little Wyoming town, barely marked on the map, but in need of a woman of God to teach its children. There in that sun-baked corner of the frontier, she lived simply. She wore her habit like armor, and the townsfolk treated her with both reverence and a certain distance, like a relic they weren't quite sure what to do with. Until he walked into her chapel, dust on his boots, hat in his hand, and a voice that rumbled like the thunder before rain. Boaz cut her. He didn't come to confess. He came with a proposal. "I need a wife," he said, eyes steady. "Not for love, at least not at first. I need someone strong. And you don't flinch from storms." She stared at him, stunned. A nun, a man, a marriage. She told herself she had no heart left to break, that her place was behind the altar, not beside a rancher in the cold Wyoming wind. But that night alone, in the tiny room above the schoolhouse, she stared at her crucifix and asked a question she hadn't dared utter in years. What if the path to heaven is through another person's hands the next morning? She packed the only things she owned, a Bible, a rosary, and a heart that had started to beat again. She did not remove her habit. She folded it slowly, reverently, as one might fold a flag after battle. And she walked out not to abandon God, but to walk with him into something wilder, riskier, more human than anything she'd ever known. Love. Not the kind written in fairy tales, but the kind forged in wind and fire between a man who had lost his hope and a woman who had hidden hers behind a veil soul for far too long. What they were about to build wasn't just a home. It was a second chance. And neither of them would ever be the same again. Before we move on, if your heart leans toward stories where love grows quietly like a prayer answered in whispers, take a moment to subscribe, like, and drop a 1 in the comments. It helps more hearts find this story, and trust me, what comes next only gets deeper. The first time Boaz Cutter stepped into the chapel schoolhouse, Sister Magdalena thought he was lost. No one came to see her unless they needed a prayer lesson or to borrow one of the worn hymnals that smelled of candle smoke and pages turned by hope. But this man, this giant of the plains, with sunburnt skin and eyes the color of coffee left too long on the stove, wasn't lost. He was looking for something. And when he opened his mouth in that voice low and even, like a train approaching in the distance, he said the last thing she ever expected. "I need a wife." She blinked, certain she had misheard. "I don't need lace or candlelight," he continued. "Don't need a woman who swoons. I need someone steady, strong. I've got land and winter coming fast, and I don't want to be alone in the cold." She didn't answer, because how could she? She was a nun, or at least, she had been. He must have seen the confusion in her eyes, the echo of vows taken long ago, the silent war waged between faith and flesh. "You've lived quiet a long time," he said softly. "So have I. But you don't strike me as the kind of woman who is meant to be alone forever." He wasn't poetic. He wasn't even particularly kind. But there was honesty in his words, a raw, aching truth that called to something buried so deep inside her, it hurt just to feel it stir. And for the first time in years, she let herself feel. She didn't sleep that night. She sat beneath the chapel window, watching the moonlight trace silver along the floorboards, clutching her rosary until her fingers ached. She whispered prayers, not for clarity, but for courage. Because Boaz Cutter wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her a place, a home, a name that wasn't sister, and maybe someday something more. He hadn't asked for her love, but he had asked for her life. And what startled her most was how much she wanted to give it. The next day, when she saw him outside the chapel again, she stepped out with a folded piece of paper in her hand, the letter she had written in the dark hours before dawn. It said only this: "You may not know how to love me yet, and I may not know how to leave God behind. But if you promise not to rush me, I promise not to run." He read it once, twice, then folded it with care and tucked it into the inside pocket of his coat close to his heart. "I won't rush you," he said. And she believed him, not because he smiled. He didn't. Not because he reached for her hand. He didn't dare. But because something in his silence spoke louder than all the sermons she had ever heard. And just like that, the woman who once wore God's veil began to fall slowly, achingly, completely into the arms of a man who didn't ask her to love him, only to stay long enough for love to grow. Before we continue, have you ever experienced a love that grew slow, but stayed strong? Tap like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, do you believe quiet love is the strongest kind? The paper was still warm from his coat pocket. Magdalena had watched him fold it, tuck it near his heart, like it mattered, like she mattered. And then he rode away into the Wyoming dusk, tall in the saddle, silent and sure. No promises, no pressure, just space. Space for her to decide if she was brave enough to trade her silence for a name that didn't come from God, but from a man who looked at her like she was still worth choosing. That night the chapel seemed colder. The walls that once echoed with prayer felt like they held their breath, waiting. The crucifix above her bed watched her not with judgment, but with sorrow. Or maybe that sorrow was hers, reflected back at her in the gold eyes of a Savior who knew what it meant to suffer for love. She knelt. She wept. Not because she felt guilty, but because she didn't. Not entirely. What Boaz Cutter had stirred in her wasn't temptation. It was a quiet invitation to live fully, to open her hands to something holy that didn't come from the altar, but from the arms of a man who had never learned to lie. She had thought she gave her life to God a decade ago. But maybe she'd only ever given him her fear. And maybe God was sending her a different kind of calling now. One written not in scripture, but in shared work, in warm stew and garden soil, in protecting someone through winter, and being protected in return. At dawn she rose. Her hands didn't shake as they reached for her veil. But her heart did. She folded the fabric slowly, carefully, not in shame, but in reverence. Like a warrior laying down armor, not to surrender, but to change the battlefield. At the bottom of her trunk, beneath a worn Bible and a stack of old letters, she found the dress she'd worn the day she entered the convent. Brown linen, modest. Nothing remarkable, except now it felt like a doorway. She brushed the dust from the hem and slipped it on. For the first time, in 10 years, she looked like a woman again. Not a sister, not a shadow of someone holy, just Magdalena, human, wanting. She left a note for the priest. "I have not lost my faith. I have found it in a different form." Then she walked toward Boaz Cutter's ranch, step by step across the prairie. And with every mile, she shed something else. Shame, fear, the ghost of vows spoken out of desperation rather than devotion. By the time she reached his fence line, the wind in her hair, the sun rising behind her like a benediction, she wasn't leaving anything behind. She was walking toward something, toward him, toward the man who didn't need her holiness, just her honesty, her steadiness, her soul. She paused at his gate, her breath catching as she saw him waiting, hat in hand, eyes searching the horizon, like he'd never stopped hoping she'd come. She didn't speak. She just opened the gate and stepped through. So before we step into her past, her veil, her vows, her quiet life behind stone walls, tell me this. Have you ever given up a dream because you thought it was the right thing to do? If that question hits home, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and leave your story or just a yes in the comments. Boaz didn't say a word when Magdalena stepped through his gate. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough, something between disbelief and reverence, like a man watching spring come to land he thought had gone barren forever. He tipped his hat, nodded once, then turned toward the house, slow and steady, giving her space to follow. And she did. Inside the ranch house was rough but clean. A single chair beside the fire, a Bible on the table, a photograph of a father long buried in the earth. He had built the home with his own hands, she realized, and left room for someone who never came. Until now. He showed her the kitchen, the stove, the bedroom she could have if she preferred some distance for a while. But she just smiled, quiet and steady, and chose the room that smelled like cedar and warmth. His room. That night they slept back to back, no touches, no questions. Just breath and firelight and the soft creak of a house learning to hold two hearts. The days that followed were ordinary, and that's what made them extraordinary. She cooked. He chopped wood. She planted seeds in the cold ground. He fixed the leak in the barn roof. They passed each other like two constellations, learning a new orbit, but every time their eyes met, something softened. Thus, Boaz never tried to kiss her. But once, when she cut her palm on a knife, he held her hand so gently it made her knees go weak. "I've got you," he murmured, wrapping the wound in cloth fingers, calloused but kind. She turned her face away because love wasn't supposed to feel like this. Not so soon, not so deeply. But there it was, humming beneath her skin like a hymn she didn't know she remembered. They ate together in silence most nights, until one evening over stew and cornbread, he asked her what it felt like to believe in God, so much she gave him her whole life. She looked up, caught off guard, then whispered, "I think maybe I didn't give him everything, because something in me still longed for this." She didn't mean the house, or the food, or the quiet land. She meant him. He didn't answer, just reached across the table and touched her wrist light as a breath warm as a sunrise. No promises, no confessions. But that night, when she turned down the lamp, he held her, not in passion, but in stillness, in safety, as if her presence alone was the miracle he hadn't dared pray for. And in that embrace, Magdalena understood something no sermon had ever taught her. Love isn't always fire and thunder. Sometimes it's the way someone says your name, the way they wait at the gate, the way they never rush your healing. It's the sound of soup on the stove, the hush of wood crackling, the feel of being chosen quietly, over and over again. She had left the convent expecting guilt, but what she found instead was grace in the arms of a man who never asked for love, yet somehow gave it one quiet evening at a time. And maybe now's a good moment to ask you, do you believe God ever rewrites the stories we thought were finished? If you do, or if you've ever felt your life shift in a way you didn't expect, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your moment in the comments below. Because for Sister Magdalena, her story was just beginning. Magdalena had known peace could be fragile. But until she met Boaz, she'd never known it could also be so fiercely worth protecting. Their days had fallen into a rhythm, a soft, holy thing, stitched together by small kindnesses, A warm cup of coffee waiting by the stove, the way he'd light the lantern early when the nights grew long. Her quiet humming as she folded his shirts, his steady presence beside her at the end of each day. But peace doesn't go unchallenged in the West. It was a Wednesday when trouble rode in, dust rising behind Marcus Blackwood's horse hate burning in his eyes. He came with papers and a sneer claiming Boaz's land with the weight of false signatures and threats too old to bury. "You're living on what was never yours," he said, voice slick as snake oil. "Time you and your nun packed up." Magdalena stood behind Boaz that day, eyes unblinking. She was no longer a woman who hid behind church walls. Boaz didn't answer at first. He looked at her, just a glance, brief but grounding. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I won't run, not now, not with her here." And that night, under a cold wind, and a sky full of stars, Magdalena whispered her answer, not in words, but in action. She asked him to teach her how to shoot, not because she wanted violence, but because love had finally given her something worth fighting for. They practiced behind the barn, her hands trembling around the rifle, his voice calm as he corrected her grip. He didn't mock her, didn't question her resolve. He knew what it meant for her to stand beside him, not as a nun, not as a guest, but as his wife. "I don't need to be saved," she said once as he checked her aim. "I know," he replied, "but it's my job to stand with you anyway." And so they prepared for whatever darkness might come. When Blackwood returned, he didn't expect resistance. But what he found wasn't just a man with a gun. He found a woman with fire in her eyes. A woman who'd traded her veil for grit, her silence for courage, her prayers for protection. It wasn't a gunshot that ended the standoff. It was a bell. The old school bell she'd used to call children to safety now rang out across the fields as Boaz raised it high and let it swing. A warning. A promise. They wouldn't be pushed off this land. Not now, not ever. Blackwood rode off with curses in his mouth and fear in his spine. And when it was over, Magdalena collapsed into Boaz's arms, not from fear, but from relief, from the sheer weight of choosing love, and being chosen in return. They didn't speak that night. They didn't need to. Because the wind howled and the lantern glowed, and in that small wooden house, two people broken brave and bound together held each other like the war was over. Because it was. They had won, not just the land, not just their safety, but the right to call this life theirs. And for the first time, Magdalena no longer wondered if God had abandoned her. Because love like this, it could only have come from heaven. This story is not just about love. It's about redemption through choice and the quiet courage it takes to leave behind what is safe in order to walk toward what is true. Sister Magdalena's journey reminds us that faith is not broken when we step off the altar, but sometimes fulfilled in the act of loving another person deeply, faithfully, and without condition. Through Boaz, she learns that God's grace does not only dwell in chapels, it lives in kitchens and gardens, in arms that hold you after the storm. The message is clear. God does not only call us to sacrifice, He calls us to embrace love that heals, protects, and rebuilds. Sometimes the greatest act of devotion is not silence or solitude, but standing beside someone in the mess of life and choosing them, again and again. That is the kind of love that mirrors heaven. If this story touched something in you, don't stop here. Click to watch the next story where another soul wrestles with faith, silence, and a love that refuses to die. And before you go, have you ever had to choose between what's safe and what your heart truly wanted? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.